Good evening and welcome. Tonight, let me take you somewhere very old and very quiet, out past the last green fields, past the edge of the maps, into a desert of red stone and long silence. There, hidden inside the mountains, where you would swear nothing could ever live, a people once built one of the wealthiest cities of the ancient world. And then they vanished and let the desert close over it like a door. The story of Petra does not begin with a king or a conqueror or a great battle, though all of those will pass through the night before we are done. It does not begin with the famous carved faces of rose-red stone that you may already be picturing. It begins with something far simpler and far more precious in a place like this. It begins with water. It begins with a single hidden spring in a wilderness of thirst, and with a wandering people who learned, better than anyone before them, how to find water where there seemed to be none, how to catch it when the rare rains came, and how to keep it secret. That secret would make them rich beyond imagining. It would let them raise a city in a place no army could reach. They were called the Nabataeans, and they came, at first, from nowhere the historians could name. Out of the deep Arabian sands, a tribe of herders and traders who owned no fields and slept in no houses, who moved with their camels between the wells, and left almost nothing behind for us to find. And yet these desert wanderers would come to control the most valuable road in the ancient world, the long incense route, along which caravans carried frankincense and myrrh, worth their weight in gold, from the far south of Arabia to the temples of the Mediterranean. Whoever held that road held a river of wealth. And the Nabataeans held it. Tonight we are going to follow the whole of their story, from the very beginning to the very end. From a tent in the open desert to a city of temples cut straight into the living cliffs. From the first mention of their name to the last silence that swallowed them. We will walk with a caravan through a crack in the mountains. A gorge so narrow that two camels can barely pass, winding for a mile between walls of stone that rise higher than any tower, and we will feel the cool air and hear the footsteps echo as the travelers of 2,000 years ago felt and heard them. And we will come as they came, around the final bend of that dark passage, to the moment the stone walls part, and a great carved temple stands waiting in the sunlight, glowing rose and gold, as though the mountain itself had dreamed it. The travelers called it, in later ages, the Treasury. We will stand before it together in the quiet. We will climb the worn rock stairs to the high places above the city, where the Nabataeans honored their gods who had no faces, worshipped as plain blocks of standing stone. We will wander the streets of tombs and sit in the great theater carved from the cliff and watch the caravans come in at dusk, heavy with silk and spice and gold. We will see the city at its shining height, under its greatest king, when tens of thousands lived here and the desert bloomed with hidden gardens. And then we will watch gently as the tide turns, as Rome comes and the roads shift away, and the great earthquakes come in the night, and the caravans, one by one, stop arriving. And we will end at the strangest moment of all, with the city lost so completely that for 1,000 years the outside world forgot it had ever existed, known only to the desert tribes who kept it secret, until a single young traveler, in disguise, talked his way through that narrow gorge and saw, with his own astonished eyes, what had been waiting all along in the silence. Before we begin, I would love to know where you are tonight. Leave a comment and tell me the name of your town and what time it is where you are as you settle in. There is something quietly lovely in knowing that all around the world, others are lying in the dark, listening to this same old story under so many different skies. And if you find that these long, slow journeys through history help carry you down into sleep, you might think about subscribing, but only if they truly bring you rest. There is no need otherwise. Your peace tonight matters far more than any number. So there is nothing left to do now but let the day go. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let the warmth settle into your hands and your jaw and the space behind your eyes. You do not have to remember any of this. You only have to listen and let the words carry you. Let your breathing slow. Let the sounds of the room drift away. Feel the cool evening air of the desert coming down off the red rock, the heat of the long day fading, the first stars opening over the mountains, one by one, in a sky as wide and dark and gentle as sleep itself. We are going back now. Far back. Past Rome, past the carved temples, to the open desert and the wells beneath the sand, to a wandering people and a hidden spring, and the first slow beginning of the lost city of Petra. Picture a land that goes on without end. The country we now call southern Jordan opens before you in the low light of morning, a world of red and ochre stone, of ridges the color of rust and sand the color of honey. There are no fences here, no roads, no roofs. Only the slow curve of the earth, the pale sky above it, and a silence so deep and so old that you can almost hear it breathing. This is where our story lives. Let your eye travel across it. Ridges of bare rock rise and fall like frozen waves, and between them run the wadis, the dry riverbeds, pale and winding, where water flows perhaps once or twice a year and then is gone. The rest of the time they are highways of dust and stone, cutting through the hills. You could walk one of these channels for a whole day and meet no one, hear nothing but your own footsteps and the small dry whisper of the wind. By day the sun hammers down without mercy. The rock grows hot enough to burn a bare hand. The air shimmers over the far ridges, and the light is so fierce and so white that the world seems to lose its edges. There is little shade and less water. A traveler learns to move in the cool hours and to rest through the worst of the heat, to shelter beneath an overhang of stone and wait, patient as the desert itself, for the sun to release its grip. And then the sun goes down and everything changes. The heat that seemed endless drains out of the land in an hour, and the desert turns cold. A sharp, clean cold that makes you draw your cloak close and lean toward any small fire. Above you the sky fills with stars, more than you have ever seen, spilled from horizon to horizon in a great pale river of light. In this emptiness the stars feel very near, and very kind, and very far away all at once. Now, into this vast and silent country imagine a caravan. Picture a long line of camels moving slowly across the plain, dark shapes against the pale ground, their bodies swaying with each unhurried step. They are heavy with cargo, roped nose to tail, and their soft, broad feet make almost no sound on the sand. Beside them walk the drivers, wrapped against the sun, watching the horizon. There is no hurry in them. The desert cannot be hurried, and they know it. Feel the slow rhythm of it, the long sway of a laden camel, hour after hour, the creak of harness, the shift of the load. Time stretches out here. A journey is measured not in miles but in days and in wells, in the distance between one drink of water and the next. The travelers eat little and speak less. They save their breath and their strength for the road, and they let their minds go quiet, moving forward into the great emptiness one patient step at a time. Above all, there is thirst. In this country, water is not something you take for granted. It is the single thread on which your life hangs. The caravan carries what it can in skins and jars, but that will not last, and everyone knows it. The whole journey is really a journey between hidden waters. A spring here, a well there, each one a secret held close, each one the difference between arriving and never arriving at all. And so the guide is the most precious traveler of them all. Picture him at the front, an older man perhaps, who has crossed these wastes since he was a boy. He reads the land the way you might read a familiar face, this ridge, that notch in the hills, the angle of the sun by day, the wheel of the stars by night. Without him, the caravan would wander in circles until the water ran out. With him, the trackless desert becomes a road that only he can see. There are other dangers, too, out beyond the firelight. Where there is precious cargo, there are always those who would take it, and a caravan far from any help is a tempting prize. So the travelers keep watch through the cold hours, listening. A distant glow on a far hillside, a sound that does not belong. These things quicken the heart. But tonight the desert is quiet, and the only lights are the stars and the small red eye of their own fire. Then, as the last light drains from the west, the guide lifts his hand, and the caravan halts. Here, in a fold of the hills that looks like every other fold, is a spring, a dark seam of water hidden among the rocks, known only to those who have kept it secret across the years. The camels smell it and press forward. The travelers kneel and drink, and the cold, sweet water fills their cupped hands, a small miracle in a land of thirst. Rest now. We have arrived. Now let us ask a gentle question, the kind that unspools slowly in the dark. Who were the people who kept these secret waters? Who knew the desert so well that they could cross it where others perished? They called themselves the Nabataeans, and in the beginning they were not city builders at all. They were wanderers, a desert people out of the deep south of Arabia, moving through the wastes with their flocks, at home in the very emptiness that frightened everyone else. Imagine their life in those early days. No houses, no walls, no fields. Their homes were tents of dark woven cloth, struck at dawn and carried onward, pitched again at dusk wherever the grazing was good and the water near. They owned little that could not be loaded onto a camel's back. Everything they had, they carried. Everywhere they slept, they left again. To them, a roof would have felt less like shelter and more like a cage. A Greek writer named Diodorus set down what he had learned of them, and his words still reach us across the centuries. These people, he wrote, built no houses and planted no crops. They did not sow grain, they did not tend vineyards, they drank no wine. Such things tied a person to one place, and one place could be surrounded, besieged, taken. The Nabataeans wanted none of it. Their whole way of living was shaped by a single fierce desire to remain free. Picture them among their animals, for their wealth walked on 4 legs. Herds of sheep and goats, and above all the camels, patient and enduring, that made the desert crossable at all. The people moved with the seasons between one pasture and the next, following the thin green that appeared after rain and vanishing again when it dried. They were herders and drovers, reading the land for grass and water, living lightly upon it, taking what they needed and moving on. And they were, above all things, free, fiercely, proudly, unconquerably free. This was the heart of them. Kings and empires rose all around the edges of their desert, armies marched and cities were built, but the Nabataeans bowed to none of it. Their independence was not a boast. It was simply the shape of their lives. They belonged to no one because they could be held by no one. The open sky was their roof, and the wide desert their protection. For here was their secret strength. When danger came, they could simply disappear. An enemy might march against them with a great army, but the Nabataeans would melt away into the waterless heart of the desert, into country so dry and so trackless that no army could follow without dying of thirst. Diodorus understood this well. They could not be conquered, he saw, because they could always vanish where no conqueror could go. The desert that seemed their poverty was in truth their fortress. Think, too, of what this means for us who look back at them. A people who built nothing and wrote almost nothing, leave almost nothing behind. No grand ruins from those early years, no rows of tombs, no libraries of clay. They passed across the land like the wind across the sand, leaving scarcely a trace. Much of what we know of their beginnings we know only because outsiders, looking in with wonder, thought them strange enough to describe. But now the story turns quietly the way a river bends. For this wandering people lived in a very particular place, astride the great road along which the wealth of the south was carried northward. The caravans we watched crossing the desert had to pass through their country, and had to cross the very wastes that only the Nabataeans truly knew. And a people who know the roads and the water and the safe ways through hold something that others will pay for and pay dearly. So the change came slowly over generations. The Nabataeans began to sell what they alone possessed: their knowledge of the desert, their camels, their guidance, their protection. They led the caravans of others through the wastes. They showed them the hidden wells. they guarded them from the dangers of the road. And in return they took their share of the precious cargo passing through their hands. The wanderers were becoming something new, the keepers of the road. And what passed along that road was no ordinary freight. It was treasure, fragrant, costly, craved by kings and temples across the whole of the known world. A people who had once owned nothing but their flocks and their freedom now found a river of wealth flowing through their desert, and they placed themselves squarely in its current. To understand how a nation of herders became the richest middlemen of the ancient world, we must follow that river to its source. We must speak of the incense. So let us drift southward now in your mind, down the long spine of Arabia to its farthest, greenest corner, the land we call Yemen and Oman today, where the dry hills meet the sea. Here, in a few blessed valleys touched by the monsoon, grow trees that grow almost nowhere else on earth. Low, hardy, twisted things clinging to the rock. They are unremarkable to look at. Yet from these humble trees came a treasure that the whole ancient world would ache to possess. Picture the harvest. A gatherer moves among the trees and makes a small, careful wound in the bark, and from the cut there slowly weeps a pale resin, thick as honey, that hardens in the sun into golden tears. This is frankincense. From another kind of tree comes myrrh, darker and more bitter. Left to dry, the drops are gathered like jewels into baskets. The sweat of the trees, transformed into something worth more than the trees themselves could ever be. And why did the world crave these small golden tears so fiercely? Because when you set them upon fire, they give up their soul in smoke. A pinch of frankincense on a glowing coal releases a fragrance clean and sweet and strange, curling upward in pale ribbons. In an age without perfume as we know it, this rising sweetness felt like something holy, a scent that seemed to carry prayers upward, to purify the air, to lift the ordinary world a little closer to the divine. So it was burned everywhere and burned by the ton. Picture the great temples of Egypt and of Rome, their altars wreathed in fragrant smoke from dawn to dusk, day after day, year after year. Incense rose in the worship of the gods, and no important rite was complete without it. Whole nations breathed it in. The appetite was endless, and it never dimmed, for the smoke was always consumed and always needed again. Every rising thread of it had been carried up from those far southern hills. It reached far beyond the temples, too, into the whole shape of a life. Frankincense and myrrh were folded into medicines and healing salves, worked into perfumes and ointments, and used with tenderness in the rites of farewell, when the dead were prepared and honored. Myrrh in particular was tied to these solemn moments. From the first breath of worship to the last quiet goodbye, these fragrances threaded through the ancient world, precious in joy, precious in sorrow, wanted at every turn. And so, being so craved and so rare, they became almost unimaginably valuable. There were times and places where a measure of frankincense was worth its weight in gold, where these hardened drops of tree sap were counted out as carefully as coins, weighed on scales, guarded like silver. Think of it. Something that wept freely from a tree in a distant valley, changing hands far to the north for a fortune. All it needed was to make the journey. And the journey was the hard part. For the trees grew only in the far south, and the buyers waited far to the north, and between them lay more than 1,000 miles of the harshest country on earth. So the caravans set out. Picture them again, longer now and heavier, moving up the western edge of Arabia in a slow, unbroken procession. Hundreds of camels, laden with fragrant baskets, plodding north week after week, month after month, from the incense lands toward the great cities and harbors of the distant Mediterranean. It was a journey to test any traveler, the crossing we already know, of thirst and heat and cold and the long silence, stretched out over many weeks and vast distances. Stage by stage the precious cargo moved, from one way station to the next, passing through many hands. And each hand that touched it added something to its price, so that by the time the incense reached the far cities it cost many times what it had at the trees. The road itself made it precious. And who commanded the road along its most difficult stretch, the long northern passage through the trackless desert? The Nabataeans. This was their country, their emptiness, their web of hidden wells. No caravan could cross it without them. So they gave the caravans what only they could give: the camels, the guides who knew the way, the water that kept everyone alive, and the protection that saw the cargo safely through. And at every stage, quietly, they took their share. Imagine the goods gathering at their way stations, at the dusty market towns that grew up along the route, baskets of frankincense and myrrh piled in the shade, and with them, in time, other treasures riding the same road. Spices from lands even farther east, silks, rare stones, all funneled through Nabataean hands. Buyers and sellers haggled in the heat, and the desert people stood at the center of it all, weighing, counting, taking their cut of a wealth that flowed past them like a river in flood. And that is what it was, a river of spice that became, for the Nabataeans, a river of silver. Coin flowed back down the road as surely as incense flowed up it, and much of it settled in the desert, in the purses and storehouses of a people who had once owned nothing but tents and flocks. Slowly, steadily, across the generations, the wanderers grew rich, rich beyond the dreams of their herding grandfathers, rich beyond almost anyone in that ancient world. But wealth alone does not explain them, and it is not their deepest wonder. For all their silver, the Nabataeans lived in a land that could kill you with its dryness, and their true genius lay not in gold but in water. Consider the miracle of it. A desert people who learned to gather and to keep water more cunningly than anyone the world had yet seen. This, more than any caravan, is the secret at the root of everything they became. Think first of how little rain this country receives. A few scant inches in a whole year, and often not even that. And it does not fall gently, spread kindly across the seasons. Comes rarely, in a handful of sudden violent storms, when the sky darkens and the rain crashes down all at once. For a few wild hours, the dry wadis roar with muddy floodwater. And then, almost as quickly, The storm passes, the water races away and sinks into the sand, and the land is bone dry again. Most people, faced with such a gift so briefly given, would watch it vanish and mourn it. The Nabataeans learned to catch it. That was their revelation, that the flash flood which drowned the wadi for an hour need not be lost, if only you were ready for it. Across generations they turned the whole landscape into a vast and cunning machine for harvesting water, reading every slope and gully for where the precious flood would run, and standing ready to seize it as it came. Picture the dams. Across the mouths of the gullies, where the floodwater would come rushing down, they threw walls of stone and packed earth low and strong. When the storm broke and the torrent came, it struck these barriers and slowed and pooled and gathered, held back from its headlong rush to nowhere. What would have drained away in an afternoon was caught and kept, so that long after the sky cleared, the water still lay quiet behind the dam, waiting to be used. Picture the channels. Along the bare faces of the cliffs they cut grooves and laid pipes of stone, threading them for mile upon mile across the rock, following the land's own subtle fall. Through these veins the caught water traveled, led patiently from where it fell to where it was needed, coaxed across the dry country by hands that understood exactly how water moves. Standing beneath such a cliff, you might trace the channel with your eye and marvel that a desert people had taught water to obey. Picture the hillsides, too, shaped and terraced into long shallow steps. Where a bare slope would have shed the rain in an instant, the terraces slowed it, holding it back stage by stage, giving it time to sink into the soil and linger there instead of racing away. Every clever contour was a small argument won against the desert, a way of saying to the fleeting water, "Stay a little longer, do not leave us yet." And the water, so persuaded, stayed. But the greatest wonder of all lay hidden underground. For catching water is only half the art. The other half is keeping it, hoarding it against the long dry months when no cloud crosses the sky. And so the Nabataeans dug cisterns, great chambers hollowed out of the living rock, deep cool vaults to hold the precious water safe from the thieving sun, which in the open would have drunk it all away long before it was needed. And they made these vaults hold what they gathered. The bare rock alone would let water seep and drain away, so they lined the cisterns with a fine waterproof plaster, sealing the stone so that not a drop was lost. Down in the cool dark, the water lay still and clean and safe, month after month. Above ground, the desert blazed and cracked with dryness. Below, in these hidden chambers, a hoard of life-giving water waited quietly, kept sweet through the longest and cruelest of summers. And here is the most cunning stroke of all. They hid them. The mouth of a cistern would be covered over and disguised, made to look like nothing at all, just more stone in a country of endless stone. Diodorus recorded it plainly. The Nabataeans dug secret reservoirs beneath the desert and marked them in ways that only they could read. A stranger might walk straight across a cistern brimming with water and never guess the treasure sealed beneath his feet. Now feel how this hidden water was both their wealth and their weapon. Should an enemy come against them, the Nabataeans would fall back into the deep desert, moving from one secret cistern to the next, drinking their fill at waters no outsider could find. Their pursuers, following into that furnace of dryness, would find no wells they could reach, and the desert itself would defeat them, turning them back parched and beaten, while the Nabataeans watched, unharmed, from beyond the reach of thirst. So hold this thought close as the chapter closes, for it is the foundation stone of all that follows. Before the tombs, before the temples, before the great rose-red city we are traveling toward, there was this, a people who had mastered water in a land that had almost none. Upon that mastery everything else would rise, the trade, the wealth, the kingdom, the city itself. Water first. Always in this story, water first. Rest now, and let it settle in the dark. And now, at last, these desert people step out of the shadows and into the written record, the first clear glimpse we have of them, caught like a figure lit for a moment by a passing torch. It comes from a restless age, in the years after Alexander the Great had swept across the world and then, still young, had died. His great empire, leaderless, was seized upon by his generals, hard and hungry men who tore it into pieces and fought one another over the shreds. One of the greatest of them was a one-eyed old warrior named Antigonus, who had carved out a mighty realm across the northern lands and hungered always for more. Word reached him of a strange desert folk to the south, a people with no cities and no king, yet said to be astonishingly rich, keeping great stores of frankincense and myrrh and silver out in their trackless wastes. To a man like Antigonus, such wealth, so lightly guarded, was simply too tempting to leave alone. So he sent a force against them, soldiers marching down into the desert to fall upon the Nabataeans and carry off their treasure. And they chose their moment with care. Word had come that most of the Nabataean men were away, gathered at a great yearly assembly far off, leaving their goods and their families more lightly watched. Under the cover of that absence the raiders came, quiet and quick, meaning to strike and be gone before anyone could gather to stop them. Picture the raid only from a distance, the way a child half asleep might picture it. The soldiers reach the place where the wealth is kept. They gather up the flocks, the silver, the fragrant treasure, and then they turn and hurry back the way they came, laden and satisfied, striking out across the desert toward the safe, settled lands to the north. Behind them the desert lies quiet under the sun. It seems for a little while that the thing has been done, and easily. But they had misjudged whose country they were crossing. Word of the raid flew across the desert faster than the raiders could march, and the Nabataeans gathered and set out after them, and here, in their own land, they were without equal. They knew every ridge and hollow, they could travel light and fast through the night, and they closed the long distance while the heavy-laden soldiers, unused to the desert, moved slowly and camped without fear, believing themselves already safe. Let the reckoning stay far off and shadowed, the way distant things do at night. Picture only a scatter of torches on a dark hillside where the raiders have made their camp, and then a swift rushing movement in the blackness around them, and confused cries carried thin on the wind. We need not go closer. When the dawn comes, the desert is quiet once more, the torches are out, and the stolen flocks and treasure stand gathered again in Nabataean hands, as though the raid had never been. When the news came back to Antigonus, the old general was not a man to accept defeat quietly. If one force had failed, he would send a greater one. This time he chose his own son, Demetrius, a famous and energetic commander, and gave him a strong army with orders to bring the desert people to heel. Once more the soldiers marched south, more numerous now and more determined, down toward the dry country and its stubborn, uncatchable folk. But the Nabataeans had learned, and this time they were warned in good time. Rather than meet the army in the open, they did what they had always done best. They made themselves and their treasure disappear. They gathered up their people and their goods and withdrew high onto a great natural stronghold of rock, a place with sheer sides and a single guarded way up, where a few could hold off many. From that high refuge they looked down and waited. And here, if you listen closely, you can hear the first faint note of what is to come, the fortress instinct that would one day raise a whole city among the cliffs. Demetrius brought his army against the rock and found he could not take it. The defenders held the heights, and the desert gave him nothing. In the end, the mighty general settled for a handful of gifts and a promise of peace, and turned his great army around, and marched away with far less than he had come for. So the very first glimpse history gives us of the Nabataeans is already the whole story in miniature. A desert people, unwarlike in appearance yet impossible to conquer, guarding their wealth behind hidden water and high rock, outlasting the greatest generals of the age simply by being uncatchable. That lesson would hold for centuries. And the instinct that sent them up onto that stronghold of stone would, in time, carve a wonder into the cliffs. But that is a tale for another night. Sleep now. Picture, first, the land itself. A wilderness of red and rugged mountains, sandstone piled and folded under a wide desert sky. And hidden somewhere among them, cradled where no traveler would ever guess, a sheltered bowl of open ground. A secret valley, ringed on every side by cliffs. You could pass within a mile of it and never know it was there. That was the gift of this place, and the reason a wandering people would one day make it the heart of a kingdom. There is only one true way in, and it is a marvel. Long ago, some ancient shifting of the earth split the mountain clean apart, cleaving a narrow passage straight through the living rock. The Nabataeans called it the sick, the shaft, the cleft. Imagine standing at its mouth as the daylight narrows before you, the cliffs leaning close, and a cool breath of shadowed air drifting out to meet you. Beyond that threshold, the world grows quiet, and the path begins to wind into the stone. We step in, and the walls rise. They climb far above your head, many times the height of the tallest tower you have ever seen, until the sky is only a thin ribbon of blue wandering somewhere overhead. The gorge runs more than a mile, twisting and turning so that you can never see far ahead, only the next curve of rose-colored rock. In places it narrows until a pair of laden camels could scarcely pass abreast. Here the desert heat falls away, and the shade is deep and blue. Listen as you walk. Every footstep returns to you, softened and doubled, murmuring back from the high stone. A voice becomes an echo, becomes a hush. The air smells of cool dust and old rock. Run your hand along the wall and feel it warm and grained beneath your fingers, carved smooth by 10,000 years of wind and water. The passage bends and bends again, and each turning hides what lies beyond, so that the journey feels less like walking and more like a slow, drifting dream. And the walls themselves are alive with color. Where the light slips down from above, the sandstone glows in bands, rose and rust and honeygold, streaked with violet and cream, as though a painter had drawn a brush along the grain of the earth. In the shadows, the stone deepens to plum and smoke. As you move, the colors shift and turn with the changing angle of the sun, so the gorge seems to breathe around you, warm and living, guiding you gently onward toward the hidden heart of the valley. Think now of what such a passage meant. A whole valley, sheltered and unseen, reachable only through this single winding cleft, one doorway, and easily watched. A handful of guards at the narrows could hold back an army. No siege engine could be dragged through those turns. No host could spread its ranks. The mountains did the rest, standing sentinel on every side. Here was a fortress that no one had needed to build, a stronghold shaped by the patient hand of the earth, waiting only to be claimed. But a fortress is nothing without water, and this hidden basin held that treasure too. Springs rose from the rock nearby, cool and steady in a land of thirst. The Nabataeans, wise beyond their years in the ways of water, cut channels into the very wall of the sick and led the flow along it, running gentle beside the traveler, whispering down toward the city. Picture the clay pipes and carved troughs threading the gorge, carrying life through stone, so that even the doorway of Petra ran quietly with water. Yet water can turn from blessing to fury. When rare storms broke over the highlands, the rain gathered fast and came roaring down toward the gorge, a wall of brown water that could fill the sick in moments and sweep away all in its path. The Nabataeans knew this danger, and they mastered it. They raised a dam across the mouth of the passage, turning the flood aside before it could enter, taming the wild water with patience and stone. And where they turned the flood aside, they gave it a new road. Through the shoulder of solid rock they cut a tunnel, a channel driven clean through the mountain by hand, so the raging water would pour harmlessly away down another valley, leaving the sick calm and dry for the caravans. Imagine the labor of it. The ring of iron on stone, month upon month, until the mountain was pierced. A people who did not merely endure the desert, but bent even its storms to their will. So here it all comes together. A valley hidden and sheltered, a single guarded doorway, springs to drink and floods made tame, and all of it set exactly where the great trade roads of the ancient world happened to cross. Defensible, watered, and standing at the meeting of the caravan routes. There could hardly be a better place in all the desert to build a city. And so, in the fullness of time, a wandering people looked upon this hidden basin and decided to stay. In the beginning, there was only cloth and firelight. Picture the earliest days, when the Nabataeans were still a people of the road. Tents pitched in the shelter of the cliffs, camels resting in the dusk, the goods of distant lands stacked in the shadow of the rock. No walls, no towers, nothing that could not be folded and carried on. A camp among the mountains, here for a season, gone with the trade. And yet something in this hidden valley held them, and slowly, over generations, they began to stay. And the change that came was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Over lifetimes, over the patient turning of many years, a camp of tents became a city carved from the mountains themselves. Not built up, brick by brick, but cut down and into the cliffs, temples and tombs and great halls drawn straight out of the living stone. Imagine returning after a long absence and finding, where canvas once flapped in the wind, a facade of columns glowing in the rock. A people writing their permanence into the earth. The stone itself was their gift and their invitation. This sandstone was soft enough to shape with iron and skill, yet firm enough to stand for ages, and it was beautiful beyond telling. Run your eye along a fresh-cut wall and see the bands of color woven through it. Rose and deep red, gold and pale cream, veins of violet and gray swirling like water caught and frozen. In the low light of morning and evening, it seems to burn from within. The mountain was not merely their quarry, it was their canvas. And they learned to work it with astonishing craft. To carve a great facade into a cliff, they began not at the bottom but at the top. Picture the masons perched high on the rock face, cutting the crown of the design first, then working steadily downward, standing on the very stone they had not yet removed. No towering scaffold was needed, no forest of timber. The cliff itself was their platform, lowered step by step beneath their feet as the monument emerged. Down and down the chisels traveled, and the mountain gave up a temple. Listen for it across the years, the sound of a city being born. Not the clamor of a battlefield, but the steady ring of iron on stone, 1,000 chisels answering one another from cliff to cliff, dawn to dusk, season to season. A patient music, echoing in the hidden valley. Each stroke lifted only a sliver of rock, and yet stroke by stroke, year by year, the mountains softened into architecture. To build this way asked not haste but faith, the faith that what you begin your children will complete. And because these were traders, their eyes had seen the whole known world. Their caravans had walked the streets of Egypt and gazed on temples older than memory. They had traded in Greek harbors and Mesopotamian markets, and knew the great works of Assyria by heart. So when they carved with the memory of everywhere. A cornice from one land, a column from another, a crowning shape from a third, all remembered, all reimagined. Yet they did not merely copy. From all these borrowed shapes, the Nabataeans wove something entirely their own, a style you would know at a glance and find nowhere else on earth. Egyptian, Greek, Mesopotamian and Assyrian forms met and married in the red stone, and their children were new. Picture a facade where a Greek pediment breaks open to cradle a desert crown, where familiar lines turn strange and lovely. It was the architecture of a crossroads people, who took the gifts of every road and made of them a single voice. But do not imagine only the carved cliffs. Below and among them stood a true living city, one you must picture now though little of it remains. Freestanding buildings crowded the valley floor, houses and workshops, markets and temples raised stone upon stone in the ordinary way. A great paved street ran through the heart of it, lined with columns, busy with merchants and beasts and the tongues of many nations. The famous facades were the city's face. This bustling town was its warm and beating heart. Walk that street in your mind. Smell the smoke of cooking fires and the sharp sweetness of incense from far Arabia. Hear the haggling of traders, the bray of camels, the ring of the coppersmith's hammer. See the temples where offerings burned, the fountains where water, carried so cleverly through the desert, splashed cool into stone basins. Fine houses climbed the lower slopes, their walls once bright with paint and plaster. This was no ghost of a place, but a crossroads humming with the life of the whole ancient world. Time has been gentler to the carved cliffs than to the built city. The freestanding walls have mostly fallen and returned to sand, so that today the great facades seem to stand almost alone, monuments without the town that once cradled them. But close your eyes and set them back. The columns rising, the market crowded, the smoke drifting up between the rose-red monuments toward the ribbon of sky. Only then do you see Petra whole, not a graveyard of stone, but a city that once was fully, gloriously alive. And here is the wonder to carry with you. A wandering people, who owned nothing that could not be carried on a camel's back, chose in the end to write their permanence not on fragile parchment nor in mud brick, but into the bones of the mountain itself. What they made could not be folded away, could not be blown off by the wind. They cut their memory into stone, meaning it to last as long as the cliffs, and after 2,000 years the mountains are still speaking their name. As the city grew, so did the people who ruled it. What had once been a loose brotherhood of caravan traders became, in time, a kingdom, and over that kingdom rose kings. Picture a hall deep in the Red City, a ruler seated in the cool shadow, the wealth of 100 trade roads laid at his feet. The Nabataeans, who had begun with nothing they could not carry, now crowned monarchs whose names would be struck on coins and carved into the living rock. Their kings bore only a small handful of names, repeated down the generations like a familiar refrain. Aretas, Abodas, Malachus, Rabble. Again and again these names return through the long roll of their rulers, one Aretas following another across the years, so that the whole line seems to echo softly with just a few beloved sounds. It is a gentle thing to notice, drifting toward sleep, a dynasty humming the same few names across centuries, father to son, in the hush of the desert. And their kingdom was no small thing. At its height it reached far beyond the hidden valley, northward to the green oasis of Damascus, with its gardens and running water, and southward down into the deep deserts of Arabia, across dunes and dry seas of sand that few outsiders dared to cross. Picture a realm stretched along the caravan roads like beads upon a thread, bound together not by conquest alone but by the shared language of trade, a kingdom of merchants, whose true walls were the trackless desert itself. Among these kings, one shines especially bright, Aretas III, who reigned in the city's rising glory. So far did his reach extend that for a time he took Damascus itself, the great northern oasis, and ruled it as his own. Imagine the boy kings of the caravan camps grown at last into a monarch whose word carried in the markets of one of the oldest cities on earth. Under him, the desert kingdom stepped fully onto the wider stage of nations. Aretas looked outward, and what he saw he loved. The bright culture of the Greeks, their art, their language, their graceful coins, enchanted him, and he took it gladly to himself. He struck the first Nabataean coins in the Greek fashion, small discs of silver bearing his likeness, and upon them styled himself a lover of all things Hellenic. Picture such a coin, cool in the palm, passing from hand to hand along the trade roads, a desert king announcing to the world that his people, too, belonged to it. Consider now the shape of this kingdom from within. At its head the king, but never alone. Beside him sat a council of advisors, elders and nobles whose counsel he heeded. Around him rose a merchant aristocracy, families grown vastly rich on the incense trade, their wealth measured in frankincense and myrrh and the tolls of 1,000 caravans. It was a realm ruled from the top, yes, but woven through with the voices of the wealthy and the wise, a partnership of crown and counting house. And there was something rarer still in the temper of this people. A Greek traveler named Diodorus, who wrote of them long ago, marveled at how free-spirited the Nabataeans were, how, even here, a king did not rule as an absolute master over cowering subjects. Power was shared, softened, held with a lighter hand than in the great empires around them. Picture a court where the ruler is first among a proud and independent people, not a distant god upon a throne. It was a freedom born of the open desert. For that was the secret of their survival. They were clever people wedged between giants. To the west and north loomed the kingdoms sprung from Greek conquest, heirs of great empires. And rising in the distance, vast and hungry, came the might of Rome. Smaller peoples were swallowed whole in such company. Yet the Nabataeans endured, slipping between the great powers like water between stones, neither crushed nor conquered, keeping their own crown while empires quarreled over the world around them. How did they manage it? Not with great armies, but with wealth and wit. Their riches could buy friendship or soften a threat. Their diplomacy could turn an enemy into a customer. They knew when to bow and when to hold firm, when to pay and when to promise. A caravan people, they understood that a deal well made outlasts a battle well fought. And so they traded and bargained their way through dangerous years that broke stronger seeming states around them. And behind all their cunning stood their greatest ally, the desert itself. Let an army come, the sands would test it as no soldier could. The Nabataeans knew every hidden spring, every secret cistern carved and sealed against the sun, while an invader found only thirst and burning emptiness. Their water was invisible to strangers, their roads known only to themselves. Picture a hostile host wandering the dunes, parched and lost, while the desert people watched from the cool shadow of the rocks, unconquerable at their backs. So the kingdom endured, Aretas following Obodas following Malachus, a realm of merchant princes thriving in the narrow space the giants left them. Rich, independent, quick and clever, guarded by sand and stone and their own uncanny gift for survival. For long generations, the desert crown held firm while the world convulsed around it. And in the heart of it all glowed the Red City, growing ever more splendid, as the caravans came and went and the kings watched over their hidden valley beneath the wheeling stars. Now let the city grow quiet, and turn your thoughts to the sacred. For the Nabataeans were a people of deep faith, and their gods dwelt everywhere among the rocks. Chief above all stood Dushra, his name meaning Lord of the Mountain, a god as vast and enduring as the red peaks themselves. Picture the reverence in which they held him, this ruler of the high stone, watching over the valley from every cliff and summit. To honor the mountain was to honor him, for he was the mountain's very soul. Yet here is the strangest and most beautiful thing. They did not carve their gods with human faces, as other peoples did, no marble eyes, no stone limbs, no likeness of man or woman. Instead, they worshipped their gods as plain, upright blocks of stone, simple and faceless, called beetles. Imagine a bare rectangle of rock, smooth and unadorned, and knowing that within it dwelt the presence of the divine. To them, the holy was too great to be shaped like a person. It was better left as pure, silent stone. These sacred stones stood throughout the city, set into niches carved along the cliffs and all down the length of the sick. As the caravans wound in through the gorge, they passed the gods themselves, watching from little shrines cut into the rock. A faceless block here, a carved recess there, each a small doorway to the divine. Picture a traveler pausing in the cool shadow of the passage to murmur a prayer before a plain stone niche, then walking on, blessed, into the waiting city. Beside Dushra reigned a great goddess, al-khazneh, mighty and beloved, whose name the traders carried across the deserts. With her stood others, Alat and Manat, ancient powers of the Arabian sands, each honored in her turn. Picture these divine presences woven through the life of the city, watching over births and journeys, harvests of trade and turnings of fortune. The Nabataeans did not walk their valley alone. At every spring and shrine and mountain height, a god or goddess kept them company in the stone. And now let us climb softly to the holiest places of all. High above the city on the flattened summits of the mountains, the Nabataeans cut their open-air altars, the high places they are called. There, beneath the naked sky, with the whole valley falling away below, they raised their prayers closer to the heavens than any roof could reach. Picture a bare stone platform on a peak, swept by the wind, where earth seemed almost to touch the sky, and worship rose unhindered into the blue. To reach them, worshippers climbed long stairways cut straight into the rock, flight upon flight of worn steps winding up the mountainside, each one carved by patient hands. Picture the slow ascent in the cool before dawn, the city dropping away beneath you, the steps rising endlessly into the paling dark. It was a pilgrimage in itself, this climb, the effort of it a kind of prayer, so that by the time you reached the summit, you had already left the ordinary world far below. At the top waited the altar, and around it, cut into the living rock, shallow basins and slender channels, hollows to hold the offerings, grooves to carry the libations of wine and water poured out in devotion. Picture the flat crown of the mountain shaped gently for worship, a raised place to stand, a stone table, small carved cups catching the first light. Simple, austere, open to every wind. Here the Nabataeans brought their gifts to the gods, high above the sleeping roofs of home. And picture, most of all, the dawn. Here the priests would greet the rising sun, lifting incense into the cold, clear air as the first gold spilled over the eastern rim of the world. Below them the city still lay wrapped in blue shadow and sleep. Above them the last stars faded. A thread of fragrant smoke curled up from the summit and drifted away on the wind. In the hush of that high place, between the sleeping town and the waking sky, the day was welcomed like a gift. And because these were traders open to all the world, their faith opened too. Along with their own gods, the Nabataeans welcomed the deities of distant lands into their pantheon, offering them shrines in the red rock. Egyptian Isis, gentle and beloved, found a home among them. Greek gods were honored beside Dashera. Picture the divine presences of many nations gathered together in one desert valley, just as its markets gathered the goods of many nations, a crossroads not only of trade, but of heaven. Let the mood of it settle over you now. Picture a rock-cut niche in the blue evening shadow, a faceless stone within it catching the last warm light and seeming, for a moment, to glow. A curl of incense drifting from a mountaintop altar into the darkening sky. The wind moving over high, lonely places. And everywhere the hush of worship, no clamor, no crowds, only the quiet awe of a people who found the holy in plain stone and open air, in dawn light and rising smoke. So the gods kept their watch over Petra, faceless and patient in their niches, high on their windswept peaks, as the city breathed below them. Dashera in the mountain, al-khazneh in the morning star, and 100 sacred stones glowing softly at sunrise all through the rose-red valley. Let that image carry you now, gently toward rest, the incense drifting, the steps climbing into the sky, and the quiet gods of the desert holding vigil over the sleeping city, beneath the slow and turning stars. By now the Nabataeans were no longer a mere tribe of wanderers, but a kingdom small, rich, and clever, set down among far larger and hungrier powers. To understand the life of Petra, you must picture it as a single lamplit house standing at a crossroads where great armies passed, its people forever watching the roads, forever weighing when to trade, when to flatter, when to promise, and when simply to withdraw behind their desert and wait for the storm to pass. To the west, across the deep valley of the Jordan, lay the kingdom of the Jews, ruled from Jerusalem. The Nabataeans and their neighbors there were bound together in the tangled way of close kingdoms everywhere, sometimes allies who traded and intermarried, sometimes rivals who quarreled over the rich lands and caravan routes that ran between them. The border country changed hands and changed loyalties, and envoys crossed back and forth beneath the wide sky, carrying gifts one year and grievances the next. When the famous Herod came to rule in Jerusalem, the ties grew closer and stranger still, for his own mother had been a Nabataean woman, and so the blood of Petra ran in the veins of the Judean court. Yet kinship did not always mean friendship. There were disputes over money, over promised tribute, over stretches of disputed land, the ordinary frictions of neighbors, magnified by the pride of kings. Mostly these were quarrels of ledgers and letters, of debts unpaid and boundaries argued. One prize above all set covetous eyes upon Petra: the trade. Everyone understood that whoever could seize the flow of frankincense and spice would seize a fortune without end, and the Nabataeans sat squarely astride that golden stream. And so, again and again, greater powers schemed to take what the desert people held, and again found that a fortune guarded by mountains and thirst is far easier to envy than to grasp. The greatest of those covetous eyes belonged to a queen whose name still echoes down the ages: Cleopatra, the last great ruler of Egypt. Ambitious, brilliant, and hungry to restore Egypt's ancient greatness, she looked upon the wealth of the desert kingdoms and desired it for her own. Through her powerful Roman ally, she gained lands and rights that pressed hard upon both Petra and Jerusalem, and for a time the desert traders found the shadow of Egypt falling cold across their affairs. There was one curious source of wealth that drew Egypt's gaze in particular: the strange black bitumen, the natural tar, that rose from the depths of the Dead Sea and floated to its surface in great dark slabs. This bitumen was prized for many uses across the ancient world, and the Nabataeans had long gathered it from the heavy, lifeless waters and sold it at a fine profit. Now that trade too became a thing to be quarreled over, taxed, and fought for among the powers. And so the Nabataeans learned to play the most delicate of games, the game of the small, wealthy kingdom that wishes to keep both its riches and its freedom in a world of giants. They paid when they must, and promised when it was wise, and let the great powers believe they were being obeyed. But always behind the courtesies lay the old desert truth: that Petra could not truly be taken, and that its masters, if pressed too hard, could simply melt away into the sands and wait. Petra's very inaccessibility made it something else besides a treasure house. It made it a refuge. When danger swept across the settled lands, when a throne shook or an enemy marched, those who could would look toward the safety of the desert. It is remembered that in one such time of peril, the family of Herod himself fled eastward, toward the protection of the great rock, seeking shelter behind the mountains that no army could easily cross. Picture, then, an evening in Petra during these uneasy years. The caravans still come and go through the gorge. The markets still hum with a dozen languages. Silver still gathers in the counting rooms. And in the halls of the Nabataean king, envoys from Jerusalem and messengers touched by the affairs of Egypt and Rome speak careful words late into the night, while the desert wind moves over the cliffs outside, patient and indifferent to them all. For that was the deep confidence at the heart of the Nabataean state. The great powers might rise and clash and fall. Queens might scheme and generals might march, but the frankincense would still need to cross the desert, and only the Nabataeans could bring it through. As long as that was true, Petra's masters could bend without breaking, yield a little without losing much, and outlast, through sheer patient cunning, rivals far mightier than themselves. And outlast them they did. The ambitious queen of Egypt came, at last, to her famous and tragic end. Her Roman world was remade by other hands, and still, when the dust of all that drama had settled, the lamp of Petra burned on among its mountains, richer and more splendid than ever. For now the kingdom was about to enter its golden age, the reign of the greatest of all its kings, under whom the desert city would rise to the very height of its glory. Every long story has its bright noon. The high season when everything a people has striven for comes at last to flower. For the Nabataeans, that noon came under a king whose name was Aretas, the fourth of that name to rule, who took the throne as the wide world was settling under the peace of the first Roman emperor, and who would reign in wealth and quiet strength for nearly half a century. It is his Petra, above all, that we have come to see. He gave himself a title that tells us much about the man, or at least about how he wished to be seen. He called himself the one who loved his people. Whether from true kindness or shrewd statecraft or both, he ruled long and mostly in peace, and peace for a trading kingdom is worth more than any conquest. Undisturbed by great wars, the caravans ran freely, the silver poured in season after season, and the wealth of generations gathered to a golden flood. And with that flood of wealth came building on a scale the desert had never seen. It is a wonderful thing to realize, as you gaze at the carved wonders of Petra, that so many of them belong to this single long and prosperous reign. This was the great age of the chisel, when a whole generation of Nabataean stonemasons turned the red cliffs into temples and tombs and monuments, and the city put on, at last, the splendid stone face by which the world would remember it. Picture Petra now at its shining height. Perhaps 20 or 30,000 souls lived within its sheltering mountains, a great population for such a place, fed and watered by the hidden engineering of dams and channels and cisterns. Smoke of 1,000 hearths rose into the evening. Fountains splashed in the dry land. Gardens, impossibly green, glowed against the rose-red rock. And through it all moved the endless traffic of the richest trade route in the world. The king did not rule alone. Beside his name on the coins of the realm appear the names of his queens, first one, and then another honored and remembered in struck silver and bronze, their faces set beside his own. It was a mark of a court that gave its women a place of dignity and regard, and it lets us hear, faintly across the centuries, the names of real people who lived and reigned in that golden city. Not only the king, but those who stood beside him. So far-reaching was this king's power that his name even brushed the pages of scripture, in a story many have heard without knowing that Petra lay behind it. In the great city of Damascus, far to the north, an official who answered to King Aretas kept the gates against a certain wanted man, and that man, the story tells, escaped only by being lowered in a basket down the outside of the city wall, into the darkness and away. So wide was the reach of the desert king. Under such a reign, Petra became not only rich but truly cosmopolitan, a meeting place of the whole known world. In its markets you might hear the tongues of Arabia and Egypt, of Greece and Syria and beyond. Its art blended the styles of many lands into something wholly its own. Its gods stood beside the gods of foreign peoples in easy company. It was a city that had traded with everyone, and taken a little of everyone into itself, and grown broad-minded and worldly in the taking. And yet, for all its openness, it never stopped being what it had always been, a desert kingdom, its greatness resting entirely upon secrets of water and sand. The gardens bloomed only because hidden cisterns fed them. The city stood only because a single gorge could be guarded. Beneath all the Hellenistic columns and the carved facades, the old genius of the wandering ancestors still held everything up, invisible and indispensable. Let yourself linger here a moment, in the good years, before the long tale turns toward evening. This was the season the Nabataeans would have wished to last forever. The king beloved and long-lived, the treasuries full, the caravans safe, the great monuments rising fresh and sharp-edged from the cliffs, their carvings brightly painted, their meanings clear to everyone who passed. A whole people at the summit of its fortune, in the middle of a desert it had utterly mastered. Could not, of course, last forever. Nothing does. Even now, far away, the slow forces that would one day undo Petra were quietly stirring new roads, new rivals, the shifting appetites of a changing world. But that lay in a future no one in the Golden City could see. For now there was only the wealth, and the peace, and the endless patient work of the chisels turning stone into wonder. And of all the wonders those chisels made in that golden age, one stands above the rest, the single most breathtaking sight in all of Petra, the one that has drawn travelers across the world to stand before it in astonishment. It waits at the end of the dark gorge, glowing rose and gold in the sun. Come and let us walk the long cool passage of the sick, and see it appear before us as the ancients saw it. To reach it, you must first pass through the sick, that great cleft in the mountains we spoke of long ago, the natural gorge that is the only easy way into the hidden heart of Petra. Step into it now, in your mind, out of the desert glare and into its cool blue shadow. The walls rise sheer on either side, close enough in places almost to touch, soaring up and up until the sky is only a bright winding ribbon far, far overhead. It is a strange and solemn thing to walk. The air is cool and still. Your footsteps echo softly off the stone. The path twists and turns, so that you can never see far ahead, and the great walls press close, banded and swirled with 100 shades of rose and violet and gold where the water and the ages have carved them. On and on it winds, a mile and more, deeper and deeper into the mountain, until you begin to feel you have left the ordinary world entirely behind. And then, always it comes as a shock, no matter how ready you think you are. The gorge makes its final turn, the walls begin to part, and through the narrowing gap ahead you catch your first glimpse of it. Not more rock, not more shadow, but a slice of something carved and columned and glowing warmly in the sunlight beyond. You quicken your step. The gap widens, and you step out at last into the light and stop and simply stare. For there, rising directly out of the living cliff before you, stands a temple front of impossible grace. Some 40 meters of rose gold stone, carved into soaring columns and crowned with elegant ornament, so fine and so precise that it seems it could not possibly have been cut from the raw mountain, but must have been dreamed into being whole. This is the monument the world knows as the Treasury, the jewel of Petra, and after 2,000 years it can still stop the breath in your chest. Look closely at its face, softened now by the long centuries but still full of wonder. 2 stories of columns rise one above the other. The upper level breaks open around a great round tower, a stone drum crowned with a carved urn, standing within the frame of the facade like a secret at its heart. And all across the stone are figures cut in low relief, divine guardians, an image thought to be the great goddess herself, eagles with spreading wings, dancing warrior women, a whole company carved from the cliff to keep watch over this place. What was it, this glorious carved face in the rock? Almost certainly it was a tomb, a royal tomb, a house of eternity for a Nabataean king, and quite possibly for the very greatest of them, the beloved Aretas of the Golden Age, laid to rest at last behind this most magnificent of all the city's monuments. Behind the great doorway the rock opens into plain, bare chambers, silent and cool, where once the honored dead were laid in the deep heart of the mountain. But its famous name comes from a much later time, and from a story woven by the desert people who lived among the ruins long after the Nabataeans were gone. They looked up at the great stone urn crowning the facade, high and out of reach, and they told one another that a pharaoh of old had hidden his treasure inside it, that the whole soaring monument was but the guardian of a hoard of gold sealed in that stone vessel far above. And so they called it the Treasury, the name it bears to this day. Some, believing the tale, even fired shots up at the distant urn over the years, hoping to shatter it and bring the golden rain showering down. And you can still see, if you look, the marks their hopes left upon the stone. But the urn was only solid rock, of course, and the treasure only ever a dream. The true treasure was the monument itself, and the astonishing skill of the hands that carved it. Stand before it a while longer as the light shifts, for the treasury is never quite the same from one hour to the next. In the flat light of midday it is pale and grand. But when the sun swings low and its rays come slanting at last down the length of the gorge to strike the facade full on, the whole great face of it catches fire, the rose-gold stone glowing so warmly it seems lit from within, as though the mountain itself were quietly burning. It is easy, gazing at such a thing, to forget the ordinary truth beneath the wonder. This was a city of the living as much as the dead, and the Treasury, for all its beauty, was one monument among hundreds. For the cliffs of Petra are honeycombed with carved facades, a whole vast city of tombs, cut patiently into the rock over generations, where a rich and careful people laid their loved ones to rest. Let us walk among them now, quietly, in the soft evening light. Lift your eyes now to the cliffs that ring the great bowl of the city, and you begin to see them everywhere, carved doorways and columned facades cut into the rock, rank upon rank, high and low, until the very mountains seem built of them. There are hundreds upon hundreds, more than 600 in all, a whole silent population of tombs gazing out over the valley where the living once thronged. Petra was a city of the dead as much as of the living, and the two dwelt side by side without fear. Grandest of all are the great tombs strung along one high eastern wall, where the cliff catches the first light of morning, the monuments we call the royal tombs, though we cannot always say for certain who lay within them. They are vast and stately, their weathered facades rising several stories, their carved columns and pediments blurred now and gentled by the ages, like faces remembered from a dream. In the low sun they glow, and the whole cliff seems to smolder softly gold. There is one they call the urn tomb, set high on the rock behind a great open courtyard, reached by climbing tiers of arches, so that to stand before it is to stand as if upon a terrace in the sky, the whole valley spread below. There is another whose banded rock runs in such rich swirls of rose and honey and gray that it is named for silk, its facade rippling with color as though woven rather than carved. Each has its own character, its own quiet grandeur. There is one so richly ornamented, its facade so crowded with columns and carved detail, that it recalls the grandest temples of the Greek world. And there is another so wide and many-doored, its front pierced with row upon row of openings like the windows of some great hall, that it has been called the palace tomb, a facade broad enough to seem less a doorway to the dead than the front of a mansion built for eternity. Among the older, simpler tombs you will notice a curious and lovely detail. The tops of many are cut not into Greek pediments but into rising steps, like a stairway climbing toward the sky. This stepped crown is an old shape, carried in the memory of the Nabataeans all the way from the ancient lands of Mesopotamia far to the east. A small inheritance from a distant world, cut faithfully into the desert rock, one tradition speaking quietly to another across the centuries. But the tombs of Petra were not only places of grief and farewell. Look closely, and near many of them you will find another chamber cut into the rock, a hall with stone benches running round its sides, a dining room for the living. For the Nabataeans returned to their dead. They came back again and again to gather at the tombs of their families and to share a meal in their presence, keeping the bond between the living and the departed warm and unbroken. Imagine such a gathering on some evening of remembrance long ago. The family comes up to the tomb as the day cools. Lamps are lit within the rock-cut hall. Food is spread and wine is poured, and they reclined together on the stone benches to eat and drink and talk. Laughter, perhaps, and old stories, and the names of the dead spoken aloud and unafraid. There in the very doorway of eternity, with the honored ancestors near at hand. In this we glimpse something tender and profound about how these people met the great mystery of death. To them it was not a wall, a final and terrible ending, but a doorway, a threshold across which love could still reach, kept warm by the simple faithfulness of coming back, of remembering, of sharing bread and wine in the old familiar company. The dead were not cast out into the dark. They were kept still within the circle of the family. And so the whole vast necropolis of Petra, which might seem at first a place of sorrow, becomes on closer looking a place of great and quiet peace. These carved cliffs are not a monument to the fear of death, but to the refusal to let death sever love. Generation after generation, the people of the rose-red city laid their dead in the enduring stone and came back to sit with them and trusted the mountain to hold them safe. Let that thought settle gently over you now, in the deepening evening, as the last light fades from the highest facades and the tombs go quiet and blue with dusk. A whole civilization's tenderness, written into a mountain. Tomorrow the city will wake again to its noise and its trade and its splendor, and to that living Petra, in the bright light of morning, we will turn next. But for now, let the city of the dead keep its beautiful, restful silence, and let your own breathing slow to match its peace. Let us wake the city now, and walk its streets in the full light of an ordinary day at the height of its glory. Morning comes gently to the hidden basin, the sun climbing over the eastern cliffs to touch first the highest carved facades, then spilling slowly down the rose-red walls into the valley, where the smoke of the first hearths already rises and the sounds of a great city stirring drift up into the warming air. At the heart of Petra ran its great main street, broad and paved with stone, lined along its length with rows of columns that cast long bars of shade across the way. This was the spine of the living city, and along it, all day long, flowed the whole restless traffic of a rich trading capital, merchants and porters, priests and officials, water carriers and children, the wealthy in fine cloth and the drovers gray with desert dust, all mingling in the bright cosmopolitan crowd. On either side of the street and in the squares beyond spread the markets, and here the city truly came alive. Picture the stalls and the open shop fronts, the goods piled and hung and heaped, bolts of dyed cloth, worked leather, copper and bronze, glazed pottery, baskets of dates and grain. And over it all hung the smell of the place, spice and incense and dust, roasting meat and fresh bread, the warm animal scent of camels, all woven together into the unmistakable perfume of a desert market at its busy noon. Listen, and you would have heard a dozen languages braided together in the din, the Arabic of the desert, the Aramaic of the traders, the Greek of the wider world, and the tongues of Egypt and Syria and lands still farther off. For Petra was a crossroads, and to its markets came people from half the known earth, buying and selling, haggling and gossiping, carrying news and rumor along with their goods from one end of the world to the other. The Nabataeans themselves were fine craftsmen, and one craft above all was their glory, their pottery. They made a fine where so thin it is hard to believe human hands could shape it. Delicate cups and bowls with walls scarcely thicker than an eggshell, painted with graceful patterns of leaves and flowers in soft red upon the pale clay. Such pottery was known and prized far beyond Petra, a small everyday marvel that carried the name of the desert city out into the world. In workshops off the main street, the crafts of the city went on all day. Potters turned their wheels and painted their delicate designs. Metal workers hammered bronze and copper. Stonemasons always were at their endless labor on the cliffs, the ring of their chisels a constant music beneath the city's noise. And in counting houses cool and dim, merchants weighed silver and tallied goods, keeping the careful accounts on which the whole golden enterprise of Petra rested. Above the ordinary streets rose the temples and public buildings of the city, great structures of dressed stone standing free upon the valley floor, their columns bright, their walls perhaps washed with color and hung with the offerings of the faithful. Here the priests kept the rites of Dashera and the great goddess. Here the affairs of the kingdom were conducted. Here the wealth of the trade was turned, in part, into the splendor of a capital worthy of its riches. As the long day wore toward its close and the light began to gild the western cliffs, a stir would run through the city, for this was the hour the caravans came in. Down through the shadowed gorge, out of the desert and into the light, the long lines of camels came swaying, dust-caked and weary, at the end of journeys of many hundreds of miles, their coming watched for and welcomed by the whole waiting city. Picture them emerging from the sick into the evening light, the great beasts groaning and folding to their knees to be unloaded, the drovers stretching their aching limbs, and the bales coming down. Frankincense and myrrh from the far south, silks that had traveled from beyond the sunrise, ivory and gold, spices and precious things gathered from the ends of the earth, all flowing at last into the storehouses of Petra. And there, waiting, were the officials of the king, to take the city's share of all this passing wealth, to weigh and tax and record, to levy the tolls and duties that turned the river of trade into the treasure of the realm. It was an old arrangement, reaching back to the first desert ancestors who had sold safe passage and water to the thirsty caravans. But now it was done in a great stone city, with scribes and scales and the full ceremony of a kingdom at its height. So the day ended as it had begun, in the rhythm of the trade that was the city's very lifeblood, the caravans unloaded, the goods stored, the accounts closed, the silver counted. Lamps began to glow in doorways up and down the darkening valley. The great cliffs faded from gold to rose to deep violet against the first stars. And Petra, rich and cosmopolitan and utterly improbable, settled into its evening in the heart of the silent desert. Of all the wonders of Petra, the one its own people may have treasured most was the one a visitor might most easily overlook, for it was everywhere and it was simply water. To us, a fountain in a city square is nothing remarkable. But here, in the heart of a killing desert, the sound of splashing water was a daily miracle, a quiet marvel of engineering made so ordinary that the citizens had the luxury of forgetting how astonishing it truly was. Think of it. Out beyond the mountains lay a land where a traveler might die of thirst within sight of shelter. And here, within the ring of cliffs, Water ran in carved channels along the streets, filled public basins, fed fountains, and flowed at the turn of the day into the homes of the people. All of it caught from the rare storms and the guarded springs, hoarded in hidden cisterns, and led by the patient genius of Nabataean engineers to the very doorsteps of the desert city. And the Nabataeans, having conquered thirst, went further. They made of their water not merely a necessity but a luxury, even an extravagance. At the heart of the city they laid out a great garden, green and cool in the midst of the red rock, and at its center a vast open pool of water shining beneath the desert sun. In the middle of that pool, it is thought, stood a little pavilion upon its own island, reached across the bright water, a pleasure house of shade and coolness in the driest land on earth. Pause and feel the sheer audacity of it. A great ornamental pool, wide and deep and full, set out in the open in a country of a few inches of rain a year, water spent not to drink, not to live, but simply for beauty, for pleasure, for the delight of seeing it shine and hearing it move. It was the boast of a people who had so utterly mastered the desert that they could afford to be lavish with the very thing the desert most cruelly withheld. There were baths, too, in the Nabataean city, places to bathe in warm water, another quiet triumph over the parched land, and everywhere the soft, civilizing sound of water moving through a place that nature had made bone dry. To live in Petra was to live surrounded, always by that gentle music. The trickle of the channels, the splash of the fountains, the lap of the great pool, the sound, if you listened, of the desert defeated. And where there is water and wealth, there is wine and feasting. It is a gentle irony worth a smile that this same people, whose desert ancestors had once forbidden wine altogether by stern and ancient law, had by now become growers of the vine and lovers of the cup. On the terraces and in the sheltered valleys, watered by their channels, the Nabataeans raised vineyards and pressed the grapes and filled their halls with the wine their forefathers had sworn never to touch. For feasting was woven deep into the life of Petra. We have already sat, in the city of tombs, in the rock-cut dining halls where families gathered to eat in the presence of their dead. But there were feasts of joy as well as of remembrance, banquets of the living, in the halls of the wealthy and the temples of the gods, where the people reclined together in the old manner to share food and wine and long good talk into the desert night. Imagine such an evening. The lamps lit and glowing warm on painted walls. The couches spread for the reclining guests. Fine thin-walled cups, painted with leaves and flowers, passed from hand to hand and filled again with wine. Music, perhaps, and laughter, and the murmur of many voices. The good smells of the feast, and beyond the doorway, the vast cool silence of the desert and the wheeling stars, held safely at bay by the warmth and plenty within. It is worth remembering, in the midst of all this comfort, what held it up. Every cup of wine, every splashing fountain, every green leaf in every garden, rested upon the hidden foundation the Nabataeans had laid, the dams and channels and secret cisterns, the tamed and hoarded water of a people who had wrung abundance from a land of thirst. The splendor above was only ever as sure as the engineering below. And so Petra lived, richly, comfortably, improbably, in the heart of the wilderness, a green and watered city of fountains and gardens and feasting, walled about by desert and red stone. But the city was more than its streets and its pleasures. Above it, on the high mountains, lay another Petra altogether, a place of temples and altars and long silence, reached by climbing stairs cut into the very living rock. Let us leave the busy valley now and climb. High above the valley floor, up among the wind and the wide sky, lies a Petra few of the city's own people may have often seen, a Petra of the heights, reached only by long stairways cut step by step into the mountainsides. To climb them is to leave the noise and the trade below and rise slowly into silence, the sounds of the city thinning away beneath you, until there is only the wind and the stone and your own steady breathing on the ancient steps. The greatest of these high places holds a monument to rival even the Treasury, and in sheer size to surpass it. It is a vast carved facade, broad and towering, hewn from a mountaintop cliff far above the city, so wide that a tall person standing in its great doorway is dwarfed almost to nothing. The world has come to call it the monastery, though that was never its first purpose, and reaching it is a pilgrimage in itself. For to stand before it you must first climb, hundreds upon hundreds of rock-cut steps, winding up the mountain through clefts and along ledges, ever higher above the shrinking valley. It is a long ascent and a steep one, but with every turn the view grows wider and the air grows cleaner, until at last the stairway delivers you, breathless, onto a high open place, and there before you rises the great carved face of the monastery against the sky. It was built, most likely, as a holy place, a temple or a great hall where the people gathered for their sacred feasts, high and apart from the everyday world. Before its facade lies a wide open court, leveled from the rock, where crowds might once have assembled beneath the open sky for the rites and celebrations of their gods. Its very grandeur, set in so remote and lofty a place, speaks of something the Nabataeans wish to lift up, quite literally, above the ordinary life of the city. The name we know it by came, like so much at Petra, from a far later age. Long after the Nabataeans and their gods were gone, when a new faith had spread across these lands, Christian hermits and holy men are thought to have sheltered in its great chamber, and to have marked its walls with the signs of their belief. And so a temple of the old desert gods became, in memory, a monastery, one faith quietly succeeding another in the same silent stone. Stand a while on that high place and turn from the monument to the view, for it is among the great sights of the whole desert world. Below and behind you lies the hidden city, but out ahead the land falls away in ridge beyond ridge, wave upon wave of bare mountains fading blue into the distance, all the way to the far valleys where, they say, on a clear day you may see the mountains of the Holy Land shimmering on the very edge of sight. Up here the silence is different from the silence below, vaster, older, unbroken but for the wind moving over the rock. The trade and the wealth and the crowded markets seem very far away and very small. And you begin to understand why the Nabataeans cut their holiest places into these heights, because to climb here and to stand in this great stillness beneath the enormous sky is itself a kind of prayer, a lifting of the heart above the small concerns of the valley. this was not the only such high place. All across the mountains around Petra, the Nabataeans cut their altars and their sanctuaries on the flattened summits, open-air places of worship reached by long stairs, with basins and channels carved into the living rock for the offerings and libations of the faithful. The greatest of them all was a broad high altar upon a peak above the city, where the priests would greet the rising sun with rising smoke of incense, high above the sleeping streets. Picture such a dawn long ago upon one of those sacred heights. The valley below still dark and quiet, the people still asleep. But up here the first light is already breaking, gilding the summits one by one. And here stand the priests, small figures against the enormous brightening sky, tending their fires, sending up the sweet gray smoke of frankincense to their faceless gods, keeping the ancient covenant between the desert people and the powers they believed watched over them. Let us come down now, gently, from the high places, back toward the valley and the story, but carry with you the memory of that great stillness, that wide and lofty silence, for it belongs to the deep character of this place. The Nabataeans were traders and engineers and hard-headed men of wealth, but they were also a people who climbed their mountains to be near their gods, and who left, carved into the highest rocks, the quiet evidence of their longing for something above the world. There is one more treasure the Nabataeans left us, the quietest of all and perhaps, in the end, the most enduring. It is not a temple or a tomb or a hoard of silver. It is something far lighter and far more powerful, scratched and carved by countless ordinary hands across the rocks of the whole desert. It is their writing. And to follow it is to follow a thread that runs, unbroken, all the way from the sands of Petra into the world of today. The Nabataeans, in their daily speech, spoke a form of Arabic, the old tongue of the desert peoples. But when they came to write, to keep their accounts, to mark their tombs, to carve the names of their gods and kings, they used, as many trading peoples of that world did, the widespread written language of commerce and record, a form of Aramaic, the great shared script of the ancient Near East, understood from Egypt to the mountains of the East. Yet they did not simply borrow it unchanged. Over the generations, in the hands of Nabataean scribes and stonecutters, that borrowed script began to shift and flow into something of its own, the letters growing more fluid, more connected, more graceful, running together in a swift and cursive hand quite unlike the stiffer forms from which it had sprung. Slowly, quietly, almost without anyone deciding it, the Nabataeans were shaping a new way of writing. And they wrote everywhere. Far beyond the city, out across the deserts through which their caravans passed, the Nabataeans left their marks upon the rocks in their thousands. Names and prayers and blessings, brief messages from travelers and traders and herdsmen, scratched into cliff and boulder along the lonely roads. A vast scattered scripture of ordinary lives, written across the wilderness by a people forever on the move, much of it still legible upon the stones today. Now here is the quiet marvel, the thing worth carrying away with you into sleep. That flowing Nabataean hand did not die when the kingdom died. It lived on, kept changing, kept flowing, passed from generation to generation and hand to hand down the long centuries after Petra faded, and out of it, in time, grew the very script in which the Arabic language would come to be written. the beautiful cursive letters read today by hundreds upon hundreds of millions of people across the world. Think of what that means. Every day, across a great swathe of the earth, in mosque and market and schoolroom and street, people read and write in letters whose distant ancestor was shaped by Nabataean traders scratching their names on desert rocks 2,000 years ago. A wandering people who left no great literature of their own, who wrote no epics and kept no famous histories, nonetheless gave the world one of its enduring alphabets, and most who use it have never even heard their name. It is a strange and moving kind of immortality. The gold of Petra was spent or scattered long ago. The great trade withered. The temples fell silent and the gods were forgotten. But the letters lived, the humblest, most everyday thing the Nabataeans ever made, carried forward not in monuments but in the daily hands of the living, passed on, quietly outlasting everything grander that the desert kingdom ever built. Perhaps that is the truest lesson of this whole long story, and one to rest your mind upon tonight, that what endures is not always what seems mightiest. Not the fortress, not the treasure, not the proud king's name, but sometimes the small, useful, generous thing. A way of writing, a way of finding water, a piece of knowledge passed from hand to hand, quietly given to the future by people who never knew how far their gift would travel. But we are not yet at the ending. The Nabataeans still had their golden city, still ruled their desert, still watched their caravans come swaying through the gorge. The world beyond, however, was changing. A new and greater power was rising in the west, spreading its long shadow across every kingdom of that age. And in time that shadow would fall, as it fell upon all the world, across the mountains of Petra. To the coming of Rome we now must turn. Far to the west, across the sea, a single city had grown into the mightiest power the world had ever known. Rome now ruled from the cold rivers of the north to the deserts of the south, swallowing kingdom after ancient kingdom into its vast dominion. And as its borders crept ever eastward, drawing nearer to the lands of the Incense road, it was only a matter of time before that long shadow reached the mountains of Petra. For many years the Nabataeans did what they had always done best. They adapted and they endured. Rather than stand in open defiance of a power so overwhelming, they became a friendly kingdom on Rome's frontier, a useful buffer and trading partner on the desert's edge, paying their respects, lending their aid, keeping their independence by making themselves more valuable alive and free than conquered. It was the old desert wisdom: bend and survive. And for a time it served them well. The kingdom lived on into its late days under its last kings. The caravans still ran. The city still flourished. One of these last rulers is remembered by a proud and hopeful title. He was called the one who brought life and deliverance to his people, a king who worked, it seems, to renew and strengthen the realm even as the great world shifted around it, and under whom Petra knew a last long season of quiet prosperity. Yet the very shape of the kingdom was changing, drawn by forces beyond any king's control. The old trade was beginning to favor the northern routes, and the heart of Nabataean life drifted slowly that way, toward a great city in the north, nearer the caravan roads to Syria, which grew in importance until it rivaled and in some ways eclipsed Petra itself as a center of the kingdom's affairs. The rose-red city in its hidden basin was, imperceptibly, becoming less central to its own realm. Then came the year that ended the long independence of the Nabataeans. Their last king died, and this time no new king took the throne. Instead, the Roman emperor of that day, a soldier emperor of vast ambition, forever extending the borders of his empire, reached out and simply took the kingdom into Rome, ending 5 centuries and more of Nabataean freedom with a stroke of the imperial pen. What is remarkable, and very much in keeping with all we have seen of these people, is how quietly it seems to have happened. History records no great war for Petra, no desperate siege, no burning of the city, no last stand upon the cliffs. As far as we can tell, the kingdom passed into Roman hands with little or no bloodshed, an annexation and absorption, the closing of one long chapter and the opening of another, rather than a sack or a slaughter. Perhaps that too was the old desert wisdom, carried to its final conclusion. A people who had always known when to bend rather than break, who had always valued survival and profit over pride and glory, may simply have understood that against the whole weight of Rome, endurance meant acceptance. Better to live on and trade on as a Roman province than to be broken utterly in a hopeless war. And so the lamp of Petra did not go out. It only changed hands. The land of the Nabataeans became a province of the empire, a new Roman province out on the desert frontier, with Petra as one of its chief cities. Roman governors now ruled where Nabataean kings had reigned. Roman soldiers watched the old roads. Roman law and Roman coin came to the markets of the rose-red city. The independent desert kingdom was no more. But the city itself, its people, its trade, its temples and tombs, all these lived on beneath the new order. And in truth, for a while, the change brought good things. Rome valued Petra and Rome invested in it. The peace of the empire kept the roads safe over vast distances. The machinery of Roman rule, for all it had taken away the old freedom, brought order and trade, and a place in the greatest commercial network the world had yet seen. The city that had been the capital of a kingdom became a proud provincial jewel of an empire. So we should not imagine the coming of Rome as a sudden darkness falling. It was at first more like an evening light, a softening, a change of color, the ending of one kind of day. The Nabataeans as an independent people faded gently into the great Roman world, their descendants living on as Roman subjects, their city entering a new and, for a time, still splendid age under new masters. Let us walk, then, through Petra in its Roman years, and see what the empire made of the desert wonder. For the city was about to put on, over its rose-red Nabataean bones, a new face of Roman stone. And only later, looking back, would it become clear that beneath all the fresh grandeur, the long, slow ebb had already quietly begun. Under Rome, the building began anew, and the old city was made grander still. The Romans loved order and display, straight lines and monumental stone, and they brought all of it to Petra. The great main street was paved afresh with fine flat stones and lined its whole length with a stately colonnade, rank upon rank of columns marching down the heart of the city in the confident Roman manner, a processional way fit for a jewel of the empire. At the street's end they raised a great gateway, a monumental arch of 3 openings through which one passed toward the sacred heart of the city. Temples were built and rebuilt. Public buildings rose. The apparatus of a Roman provincial capital took shape among the Nabataean cliffs. Old and new stood side by side. The carved tombs of the desert kings looking down upon the columned street and the arches of Rome, 2 great civilizations layered in a single valley. Rome bound its new province into the wider empire with a road, a great highway driven across the desert, linking Petra and its sister cities northward and southward, part of the vast network of imperial roads along which soldiers marched and merchants traveled and the news of the world was carried. Petra was no longer the guarded secret of a desert people. It was a named and numbered station on the map of an empire that spanned the known world. The city gathered Roman honors as the years passed. It was granted proud titles, marks of imperial favor, its standing recognized and rewarded. When a certain emperor, a great traveler who loved to visit the far corners of his empire, came through these eastern lands, the city took his name as an honor, adding it to its own, a sign of how highly this desert jewel was still regarded in the councils of Rome. And the life of the city went on, richer and more cosmopolitan than ever. In the colonnaded street the crowds still flowed, but now among them walked Roman officials and soldiers, and the goods of the whole vast empire mingled in the markets. The old Nabataean gods were worshipped still, now often beside or blended with the gods of Rome. Petra had always been a place where worlds met and mingled. Under Rome, it simply met more of the world than ever before. Picture it at its Roman height. The paved street gleaming after a rare rain, the long lines of columns throwing their shadows, the temples bright upon their platforms, the carved cliffs rising rose and gold above the bustle, and the whole improbable city humming along in the desert as it had for centuries, only dressed now in the confident stone of empire. To any citizen walking those streets, it must have seemed that Petra would endure forever. But the deep foundation of Petra had never been its stone. It had been its trade, the river of frankincense and silk and spice that flowed through the gorge and left its wealth behind. The temples and the columns, the honors and the crowds, all of it rested, as it always had, upon those swaying caravans coming in at dusk. And it was there, in the unseen currents of that trade, far from any battlefield, that the true danger to Petra was quietly gathering. For a city can be strong in every visible way, well-built, well-governed, at peace, adorned with every grandeur, and yet be undermined at its root by changes no wall can keep out and no army can fight. The greatness of Petra had always depended on a single fact, that to move the treasures of the south to the markets of the north, you had to cross its desert. Remove that one fact, and everything else, however splendid, would follow it down. And that one fact was, in these very years, beginning to change. New paths were opening for the world's goods to travel. Paths that did not pass through Petra at all, that had no need of its guides or its water or its guarded gorge. Slowly, invisibly, at first hardly noticed amid all the Roman splendor, the great river of trade that was the city's lifeblood was beginning to find other channels, and to leave the rose-red city behind. The people of Petra, walking their fine colonnaded street beneath the tombs of their ancestors, could not have seen it happening. Such changes are too slow, too vast, to be felt from within a single life. But we, looking down the long years, can see the tide beginning quietly to turn. And so we come to the saddest and gentlest part of our story, not a fall but a fading, not a sack but a slow and tender forgetting. Nothing dramatic marks the beginning of the end of Petra. There is no burning, no massacre, no single catastrophe to point to. There is only the trade, thinning year by year, caravan by caravan, as the goods of the world began to travel by other ways. The decline of the rose-red city is a story not of violence but of quiet subtraction, of a great river slowly running dry, and of a people left, at last, beside its empty bed. The first great change came by sea. For generations, merchants had learned the secret of the ocean winds, the steady seasonal breezes that blow across the wide waters between Arabia, Africa, and the lands of the East. Sailors discovered that by trusting these winds, they could carry the treasures of the South and the East directly by ship over the water to the ports of Egypt and the Mediterranean in a fraction of the time the old desert roads required. Think of what that meant for Petra. Why send a caravan on a 2-month journey across a killing desert, paying guides and water sellers and toll takers at every stage, when a ship could carry the same goods more swiftly and more cheaply over the sea? One by one, the great merchants made the sensible choice. The frankincense and the silk and the spices began to travel by water, and the long desert road through Petra fell quiet. There was a rival on land, too. Away to the north, another great caravan city had risen, a splendid oasis metropolis that commanded the routes across the northern deserts toward the east, and grew fabulously wealthy, doing for its own region what Petra had long done for the Incense road. As the trade shifted northward and the world's routes were redrawn, this rival flourished and drew to itself much of the glory and the gold that had once flowed to the rose-red city. And there was a deeper change, still slower and vaster than any shift of roads, a change in the very hearts of the people who had once craved the frankincense. For centuries, the smoke of the desert resins had risen from the altars of 1,000 gods across the ancient world. But the beliefs of that world were beginning, profoundly, to change. And as they changed, the great appetite for incense that had made Petra rich began, gently, to fade. As the old religions gave way to a new faith spreading across the empire, the endless burning of incense on countless pagan altars slowly diminished. The lavish use of fragrant resins in the funerals and worship of the old gods declined. The demand did not vanish overnight, but it softened and shrank decade by decade. And with it shrank the fortune of the people whose whole greatness had been built upon carrying that fragrant smoke to the temples of the world. So the currents that had made Petra now unmade it, all at once and from every side, the sea routes drawing the trade to the water, the northern rival drawing it away by land, the changing faith of the world drawing away the very demand that had begun it all. The city had done nothing wrong. It had simply been built upon a river of trade, and the river, in its own slow time, had chosen new channels. Picture Petra now in these later years, still standing, still inhabited, still grand to look upon, but quieter. The caravans that come through the gorge are fewer. The storehouses are less full. The markets are less crowded, the many languages fewer, the great flow of silver slackening to a trickle. The city is not yet dying, but the glory is going out of it, gently, like the warmth leaving a stone after the sun has set. And a city that lives by wealth, when the wealth departs, cannot easily hold its people. Slowly, over generations, the young and the ambitious began to drift away toward the places where fortune had gone, toward the ports, the northern cities, the living centers of a changing world. Petra, which had drawn people to itself for centuries, now began quietly to lose them, a few at a time, year upon year. Still the great cliffs stood, and the carved tombs of the kings, and the columned street, and the temples on the heights. Still the hidden channels caught the rare rains and fed the fountains. The bones of the wonder remained. But the tide of life that had filled it was going out, and Petra was entering the long twilight that would end, at last, in silence and in sand. And into that twilight, one night, came a great shaking of the earth. It came, as such things do, without warning, in an age when the city was already weakened by its long decline. Deep beneath the desert, the patient forces of the earth, which had split these very mountains in ages past, stirred again, and the ground heaved, and the rock shook, and in a matter of moments much of what the Nabataeans had spent 5 centuries building was thrown down. Let us pass over the terror of that night gently, as befits a story told for rest, but picture, in the quiet afterward, what the dawn revealed. Great buildings that had stood for hundreds of years lay broken. Columns that had lined the proud street were toppled and scattered. Temples were split and fallen. The work of generations lay in ruin under the pale morning light, and a stunned and lessened people crept out to look upon the wreck of their city. But the cruelest blow was not to the temples or the tombs. It was to the water. The earthquake shattered the intricate ancient system of channels and pipes and cisterns on which the whole life of the desert city utterly depended, the hidden genius of the Nabataeans, the tamed and hoarded water that had made Petra possible at all. And that delicate machinery, once broken and no longer tended by a rich and numerous people, could not easily be made whole again. Here was the deepest wound, from which the city would never truly recover. For Petra had always been an act of will against the desert, a green and watered place held in being only by constant care and cunning. Let that care fail, let the channels choke and the cisterns crack and go untended, and the desert, patient and eternal, would simply reclaim its own. The shaking of the earth had not merely damaged Petra. It had begun to hand the city back to the sand. And yet, Even now, Petra did not die. It endured, smaller and poorer, as it had endured so much before. The world had changed around it once again, and now the new faith that had spread across the empire came to the rose-red city too. Where the faceless desert gods had once been worshipped, now churches were raised, and the people who remained gathered to a different altar beneath the same enduring cliffs. In these later, quieter centuries, the Christians of Petra did a thing that touches the heart to picture. They took some of the great old tombs and temples of the vanished kingdom and made them into churches, consecrating the carved chambers of the ancient dead to their own new hope. One of the grandest of the royal tombs, high on its eastern cliff, was given over to Christian worship, its silent stone filled once more with prayer and song. We have a precious, haunting glimpse into this twilight city, preserved by pure chance. In one of its churches, a great cache of documents was one day lost to fire, and the very burning that destroyed them also charred and preserved them, so that centuries later they could be found and, with painstaking care, read again. They speak of ordinary lives still being lived among the ruins, of property and marriage, of business and family, of a small community carrying on, quietly, in the shadow of its own lost greatness. So we should not imagine Petra in these years as an empty ruin, but as something gentler and sadder, a modest town living on amid the monuments of a mightier past, its people going about their small affairs beneath the towering tombs of kings whose very names they may have half forgotten. The wonder had shrunk to a village. But the village still had its dawns and its dusks, its births and its bargains, its faith and its quiet endurance. Then, generations later, the earth trembled once more. Another great shaking, later in that long twilight, throwing down still more of what remained and driving away still more of those who lingered. Blow by blow, slow decade by slow decade, the city was worn down, emptied out, given back. And each time fewer returned, and fewer rebuilt, and the sand crept a little farther into the silent streets. And so, at long last, the day came. No one can say exactly when, for such endings have no single hour, when the last of those who called Petra home gathered what they had and walked out through the gorge for good, leaving the rose-red city to the wind, the lizard, and the drifting sand. The lamp that had burned among these mountains for 1,000 years and more flickered, guttered, and quietly went out. And the great forgetting began. What happens to a wonder when the last people leave it? Nothing sudden. Only the slow, patient work of time and desert. The wind blows as it has always blown and carries its endless freight of sand into the empty city, heaping it against the carved facades, drifting it across the fallen columns, filling the silent chambers grain by grain, year by year, century by century, with the soft and burying dust of the wilderness. The broken channels lay choked and forgotten, and without them the gardens died and the fountains fell dry, and the green that the Nabataeans had coaxed from the desert withered back to bare rock and thorn. The paved street lay buried. The great pool held only sand. The desert, which the Nabataeans had held at bay for so long by such genius and such labor, flowed back in at last over everything, patient and irresistible, taking back what had always, in the end, been its own. and the wider world simply forgot that Petra had ever been. The empires that had known it fell in their turn, and new powers rose, and the maps were drawn and redrawn, and on none of them, after a time, was there any mark for the rose-red city in its hidden basin. In the great libraries and courts of distant lands, Petra passed out of memory entirely, until even its name became only a faint word in a few old books that hardly anyone read. For close to 1,000 years, this was so. Think of the vastness of that silence. 10 centuries in which one of the most beautiful cities ever built by human hands stood empty and unknown among its mountains, its glorious carved facades gazing out over a valley where no one came, glowing rose and gold at every sunrise and sunset with no eye to see them, keeping their long and patient vigil in the heart of the forgotten desert. And yet, this is the part that saves the story from utter sorrow. Petra was never truly, completely alone. For the desert itself was not empty. Across these lands still moved the Bedouin, the wandering tribes who were, in their own way, the distant heirs of that ancient wandering spirit, and some of them made their home in and around the ruins, sheltering in the ancient chambers, watering their goats and their camels at the old springs that still faithfully flowed. To these desert people, Petra was no lost wonder to be marveled at, but simply home, the familiar red rocks and carved caves among which their families had lived for generations, whose every corner they knew, whose ancient name and hidden ways they held as their own quiet inheritance. They asked no questions of the great facades. They simply lived among them as people live among the mountains, and kept, without meaning to, the secret of the place. And they guarded that secret warily, for these were hard times in a hard country, and strangers were rarely to be trusted. Outsiders who came prying about the desert, asking after old ruins, poking into hidden valleys, might well mean trouble or greed or worse. And so the location of the great ruins in the mountains was kept close, shared with no curious foreigner, a thing known to the tribes of the desert and to almost no one else in all the wide world. So there it lay, through all those long centuries, one of the wonders of the earth hidden in plain sight. Not buried beyond finding, not lost beneath the sea, but simply held quietly out of the world's knowing, behind a gorge and a desert and the closed lips of the people who lived there. A whole magnificent city, waiting in the silence, for someone from the outside to come around the last bend of the sick and remember it. And in time, at the very edge of our own age, someone did. He came as a stranger to that country, from a cold and distant land, driven by a curiosity as deep and restless as the old trader's hunger for gold, and he would have to be as clever and as careful as any Nabataean to win his way to the secret. His is the last chapter of our long story, and one of the most remarkable of all. Let us follow him gently to the threshold of the lost city. He was a young traveler from Switzerland, learned and adventurous, who had taken service with a society in far-off Britain that hungered to map the unknown corners of the world. To journey safely through these eastern lands, where a curious European might meet with great danger, he had done a bold and painstaking thing. He had spent years learning the language and the faith and the ways of the region so thoroughly that he could pass, to all appearances, as a Muslim traveler of the East, under an assumed name, moving quietly where no obvious foreigner could go. As he journeyed through the desert country, he began to hear whispers, rumors among the local people of magnificent ruins hidden away in a mountain valley, ancient carved wonders that the tribes kept to themselves and did not willingly show to outsiders. His scholar's heart leapt at the tales. He grew certain that here was something extraordinary, something the outside world knew nothing of. But he could not simply ask to be taken there. Open curiosity might unmask him as a prying stranger, and that could cost him dearly. So he devised a clever and careful pretext. He let it be known that he wished to make a pious offering, to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of a holy prophet said to lie among the mountains beyond the hidden valley. It was a reason no one could easily refuse, a plausible errand of devotion that would carry him, as if by chance, straight through the secret ruins on his way. He hired a local guide, bought his goat, and set off toward the mountains, hiding his true purpose behind his prayers. And so, guided by a man who thought him only a traveler with a vow to keep, he came at last to the narrow entrance in the rock and passed into the sick, down into that cool, deep, winding gorge, the walls soaring close on either side, the light falling dim from the thin ribbon of sky far above, the path twisting ever deeper into the mountain exactly as it had for the traders and pilgrims of 2,000 years before. He walked it with his heart pounding, not only at the wonder growing around him but at the danger, for he dared not seem too curious, dared not stop and stare, dared not be seen taking more interest than a pious traveler should. He could only steal glances at the astonishing carvings emerging from the rock and commit them secretly to memory, scribbling a few hidden notes when his guide was not looking, drinking it all in while pretending to see nothing at all. And then the gorge made its final turn, and the walls drew back, and there before him, glowing rose and gold in the shaft of desert sun, rising sheer and impossibly graceful from the living cliff, stood the great carved temple that we have come to call the Treasury. After 1,000 years of silence, a traveler from the outside world had come around the last bend of the sick and looked upon the lost city of Petra and known it for the wonder it was. He did not dare linger long. The pretext of his goat and his prayers could not hold forever, and a curious stranger in that guarded place walked always in some peril. But he had seen enough. He carried the memory of it out of the desert and back to the wider world, and when at last he told of what he had found, a magnificent lost city, carved into the mountains of the desert, unknown for 1,000 years, the world was astonished and would never forget again. The long silence was broken. Petra had been found. And so the lost city was lost no longer. But think, for a moment, of all it had waded through. The Nabataeans left us no histories of their own, no epics, no list of their kings in their own hand. Almost everything they wrote not in books but in stone and in water, in the tombs that still glow at dawn, in the channels that still catch the rare rain, in the quiet genius of a people who made a garden in a place of thirst. They did not tell us their story. They simply built it and let it stand. And it is still standing. The rose-red cliffs still hold their carved temples up to the morning sun, exactly as they did when the caravans came. The gorge still winds cool and dark to that first breathtaking view. And the flowing letters the Nabataeans once scratched onto the rock did not vanish either. They slowly changed and passed from hand to hand down the centuries, until they became the very shapes of Arabic writing, read today by hundreds of millions who have never heard the name Nabataean at all. That, perhaps, is the truest kind of endurance. Not the empire that shouts its own name down the ages, but the quiet gift passed on without a signature. The hidden water, the patient stone, the letters that outlived the hand that first drew them. A wandering people out of the desert, who owned no fields and left no chronicles, and yet whose city the whole world now travels across the earth simply to stand before, in silence and wonder at. But all of that can wait for the morning. There is nothing left for you to do tonight. The desert is dark and still now, the red stone cool beneath a vast and starry sky, and the long caravan of this story has finally come to rest. So let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve. Sleep now and sleep deeply. The old city will keep watch in the dark, as it has for 2,000 years, and another quiet story will be waiting for you whenever you are ready to listen again. Good night.